Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're still studying the book of Ezekiel, and today we're going to do chapter 19. It's all prophecy today, but it's not that far into their future. It's about the death of two kings. It's about the death of a nation, and it's about the fall of Jerusalem. And none of that stuff has happened as of the writing of this chapter by Ezekiel. There's three sections. There's a death of the first king, which is in verses 1 through 4. There's the death of another king, which is in verses 5 through 9. And then there's about the fall of Judah, is in verses 10 through 14. So just keep in mind that it hasn't happened yet. This is all prophecy. So the people have to, when they hear these words, they have to interpret what they're hearing. It can't be very uplifting for them. But at the same time, I think that they're still living under the four false assumptions that we've talked about from the beginning. One of which was Jerusalem will never fall. God will not allow that to fall. It's the city that's got his name on it, and that's where his temple is. So that's going to be a safe haven for the Jews, even though Babylon is standing right outside the gate, ready to crash right through it. So nevertheless, I guess they're just kind of living in denial. All right, so let's get right on into it. Let's look at verses 1 through 4. One of the things that make some Old Testament scripture so difficult for us is that we are not Jewish. And because of that, we don't know Jewish history very well. So don't be surprised if, I tell you some things today, you say, I've never heard that before. And if you had, you probably wouldn't remember it because we don't know the names of the kings. We're going to hear, I'm going to be throwing a couple of names around here, 2 or 3 names that I've thrown around, one of which I've thrown around before. But nevertheless, we just don't know what they are. But these people that are hearing this are very well aware of what's being said. So let me read verses 1 and 2. Take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel and say. Okay, take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel. This is about 4 funeral dirges, actually. It's about we're in the last days of Judah. We're going to be talking about the death of Israel. We're going to talk about the fall of Jerusalem and the death of a couple of kings. So the nation is going to be gone. The death of the nation is just read right into that. So that's just part of what we're talking about today. This verse 1 refers to the princes. It says, take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel. The princes, it's not a term that we throw around very well. We're talking about kings, and we're talking about elders, and we talk about other things. But Ezekiel uses the word princes here. And Ezekiel calls the last kings of Judah princes because he did not recognize their legitimate right to reign. So he calls them princes, but they're kings. All right. Verse 2 talks about, I don't think I read verse 2. Let me read verses 1 and 2 again. Take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel and say, what a lioness was your mother among the lions. She lay down among them and reared her cubs. A lion, the lion here is generally understood to be Judah, the nation of Judah. The mother is the line of David, the dynasty of David. I want to kind of step back into the past here for a minute. Some things I've already told you here in our study of Ezekiel. I made the point very clear when we studied Hosea that Hosea was preaching to the northern kingdom. After the Civil War, we got two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was made up of 10 tribes. And during that time of the northern kingdom, there were 10 dynasties of kings, and all of them were bad. For the nation of Judah, which is the southern kingdom, there was one dynasty, and it was the line of David. Okay, so the mother here is the line of David, the dynasty of David, and this Davidic line produced many cubs or leaders or kings. Okay, that's what came out of the line of David. It was a dynasty, so one father had a son, he became king. That son had a son, he became king, right on down to where we are talking in Ezekiel today. All right, let's look at verse 3. She brought up one of her cubs, and he became a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater. Mercy. One became a leader that really acts like a lion. That leader was probably Jehoahaz. He was the son of Josiah, which was the number 16 king in the line of David. And he was known for his religious reforms. He was killed by Pharaoh in battle around 609 or 608, something like that. Then his son becomes king, Jehoahaz, and he's a king who Josiah was the king that ushered in religious reforms. He was killed, and Jehoahaz becomes king, and he is the one that's running around here acting like a lion. So let's look at verse 4. The nations heard about him, and he was trapped in their pit. They led him with hooks to the land of Egypt. That doesn't sound good. He's acting like a lion, and they trapped him. But this lion was captured, and he was led off to Egypt. We have evidence of this type of description of this king being in captivity. He was heard about, and he was trapped in their pit, and they led him with hooks to the land of Egypt. I want to read something to you. This is from an extra biblical source. It's from some Assyrian inscriptions about a king that had been conquered. Not necessarily this king, but one that had been conquered. It says here, I pierced his cheeks, put a ring in his jaw, placed a dog collar around his neck, and made him guard the east gate of Nineveh. An Assyrian relief also shows King Esarhaddon holding a rope tied to rings in the lips of two captives. So that is not an uncommon way to describe the capture of anybody, but in this particular case, it's talking about the capture of their king. All right, let's look at verses 5 through 9. So that would be the death of the first king. Verses 5 through 9. So this is one king that is no longer there. So now Judah needs another king. So let's look at verse 5. Verse 5. When she saw her, now keep in mind this is looking into the future. When she saw her hope unfulfilled, her expectation gone, she took another of her cubs and made him a strong lion. Another one of these cubs that's coming up in the line of David, and he's going to become a strong lion. Jehoiakim was probably a bad king. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead. This new lion is probably Jehoiachin, and he reigned around 605 BC, something like that. Jehoahaz reigned before him, and Josiah reigned before him. And these were all short reigns. Josiah's reign was pretty long. It was 40 or 50 years. But all the others got shorter and shorter and shorter. Time is getting compressed because of all the alliances and the double crosses and all the stuff people are doing trying to maintain their power. But so Jehoiachin is probably the new lion, that cub that became a lion, and he acted like a lion, and he was doing the things that a lion might do in verses 6 and 7. Let me read that. Verse 6 and 7. He prowled among the lions, for he was now a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater. That sounded like the other guy, didn't it? He broke down their strongholds and devastated their towns. The land and all who were in it were terrified by his roaring. So Jehoiachin, that's this guy. This is the new cub that became a strong lion. Was probably a bad king. Think about it. Think back to our alliances and double crosses that Judah got into. You know, we talked about which we haven't gotten to this week, but we talked about Zedekiah, for example, was a puppet king, a vassal king that was set in power by Babylon, and he started thinking that he really was a king, even though he was just a puppet. He decided to make a deal with Egypt for protection. And so what he's done is double-cross the number one most powerful country in the world, which was Babylon. If you're going to double-cross somebody, it probably shouldn't be them. And so they ended up capturing Zedekiah and carrying him off to Babylon, which we'll talk about again probably before the day's out here. But his deal was with Egypt and all that double-cross that was going on. So let's look at verse 8 and 9. Then the nations came against him from those from regions around about. They spread their net for him, and he was trapped in their pit. With hooks they pulled him out. They pulled him into a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. They put him in prison, so his roar was heard no longer on the mountains of Israel. This was the vassal king that we're talking about. Jehoiachin was captured and led to Babylon. Okay, this was not Zedekiah. This was Jehoiachin. So what Babylon liked to do is not necessarily kill the kings. They just take them captive and haul them back to Babylon. And that's what happened to Jehoiachin. They put him in a cage, put fish hooks in his jaw, just like the other guy that we talked about. And he was led off to Babylon. If we go back to chapter 17, I'm not going to do that today, but maybe you'll remember some of the details. We talked about a big, strong, powerful eagle flying into the top of a tree and breaking off the top of a tree and carrying it off, and it gets planted in the ground. That was one of these kings, if you recall. He was dislodged from his reign of power in Judah by Babylon, and he was taken to Babylon, and that's what that signified, and that's what is happening here. That was in chapter 17, verse 4. He was put in a cage, probably maybe neck stocks and led away, and that sort of thing. So It's the same kind of deal that happened to the other king, the first king that we talked about. He had fish hooks put in him, and he was just led around and paraded around, for example, in front of the people, because Babylon, as does every nation, likes to humiliate the people, that, particularly the leaders of the people that they have conquered. So this is the funeral lament for the last true king of Judah. For the next king, Zedekiah was appointed by Babylon as a vassal king. Now for the funeral lament for Zedekiah and the people of Judah. Remember, this is a prophecy that has not yet been, it's been fulfilled now, but as of the time of this writing of these words, it had not yet been fulfilled. Let me give you some background. I've already mentioned it once. I want to do it again because it's so important. With the last king, which his name was Jehoiachin, after he was captured and carried off to Babylon, Babylon appoints a new guy, and his name is Zedekiah. We've talked about it many times. When I tell you the story surrounding him, you'll say, oh, yes, I've heard that before. But I want to remind you of it because it's so important. This guy was a vassal king. It means he's a puppet. He was put in power because Babylon needed to have somebody in town there knowing what was going on to keep them apprised of every situation. And what Zedekiah did, he decided, well, hey, I am somebody. I am now king, and I think I'll do what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is kind of sneak out to Egypt and talk to them about making a deal with them for protection from Babylon. Babylon gets word of that, and they come into town and take Zedekiah. Or actually, they didn't get him in town. He tries to get out of town. They catch him out on the road somewhere, and they take him captive and all of his sons. And what they did was kill all of his sons. Not him, but all of his sons while he watched. And then they gouged his eyes out. So that would be the last thing he saw before he went blind. And then they carried him off to Babylon, where he lived out his days. They didn't kill him. He had to remember all of that last thing that he saw as he lived out his days. And I think Scripture even talks about him eating with the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. But nevertheless, that's what happened. They didn't kill him. They just carried him off. And with the carrying off of Zedekiah, that signals the end of the nation of Judah. Because right about that same time, the fall of Jerusalem is going to happen. And that's what we're going to look at right now, which is in the last few verses, 10 through 14. Let me read verses 10 and 11, chapter 19. Your mother was like a vine in your vineyard, planted by the water. It was fruitful and full of branches because of abundant water. Verse 11, its branches were strong, fit for a ruler's scepter. It towered high above the thick foliage, conspicuous for its height and for all of its many branches. The last real leader is gone, and the temper changes from speaking of Judah like a mother. Now it's switched to be discussed and terminology used to make the country like a vine, which is what we talked about in chapter 17. Notice the fruitfulness and the strength of the vine. It flourishes through nurture and care by God, though God uses Babylon as the caretaker. Babylon was the rod of discipline, but they're also the country that God chose to watch after Israel, or after Judah. All right, let's look at verse 12 and 13. but it was uprooted, this vine. I wonder if I need to go back and read through that again. Just keep that in mind. We were talking about a vine that had been nurtured and was growing as big and all that. And then it says, but. There's always that but when you're talking about prophecy. Verse 12 says, but it was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground. The east wind made it shrivel. It was stripped of its fruit. Its strong branches withered, and fire consumed them. In verse 13, now it is planted in the desert in a dry and thirsty land. Now, we had a vine that is flourishing, and somebody comes along and pulls it up by the roots. We talked about that over in chapter 17, verses 7 to 10. And it says, it was uprooted, here it says in verse 12, it was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground. The east wind made it shrivel. Now, I want to ask you a question because I want you to remember this. What does the east wind signify? I can wait. Somebody needs to answer me. Oh, you don't have a microphone. I'm sorry. The east wind signifies Babylon. Babylon comes from the east. It's the east wind, referred to as the east wind, and it is Babylon that uproots that vine. And if you go over to chapter 17, verses 7 to 10, it talks about that vine that turned away from the main caretaker and grew towards another caretaker, and that caretaker was Egypt, as we discussed. And that's going back now and talking about the double cross between Zedekiah deciding he would try to make a deal with Egypt and double cross Babylon, and that it talks about being uprooted over there as well. It's the same thing here, talking about the same thing. It parallels very closely to it. But the Babylon, the vine Judah was uprooted by the east wind, which is Babylon in this prophecy, and planted in the desert, which is Babylon here. And they would be, in other words, they would be taken away in exile. Being planted in the foreign land is significant because if you recall what happened to the northern kingdom when they were taken captive by Assyria, they weren't planted anywhere. They were taken captive and marched off into the nations, and they were assimilated into the nations, so they almost just ceased to exist. They're referred to now as the 10 lost tribes because we don't know where they are, but God knows where they are because he's issued so many promises about how everybody's coming back, going to be coming back to Jerusalem, and all the other promises apply to them as well. So, but this is different. These people are taken captive, picked up and moved to Babylon and set down where they stay for 70 years. So they were transplanted, but they're going to get to return to their country. They're going to get to return to Jerusalem. We're going to see under the reign of the Medes and the Persians when they capture Babylon. Okay, so let's keep going. Verse 14, I guess that's the end of the chapter. Verse 14 says this. Fire spread from one of its main branches and consumed its fruit. No strong branch is left on it, fit for a ruler's scepter. No strong branch is left on it, fit for a ruler's scepter. That means there will be no more rulers. There will be no more kings. Judah is dead as a nation, or will be when Babylon actually conquers them and takes them all captivity and destroys Jerusalem. So this is the prophecy right here that's going to happen. And of course it has happened, and it's going to stay like it is now, where they don't have all of their land. They've never had all their land, but they will have their land. We've got the promises of the latter part of Ezekiel. They're going to have their land. And they're going to come back as a nation. We've got the Valley of Dry Bones that prophesied that in chapter 37 of Ezekiel, and that actually came to pass in 1948 when they became a nation again by the United Nations decree. So these are the prophecies that we're talking about today, and they were directed to the people. They were probably having a hard time accepting it because they had those four false assumptions that they were hearing from false prophets saying, don't listen to Ezekiel and the other guys that are claiming to be prophets of God. We've got the deal, better deal. It's much more palatable to hear what they had to say. And so they decided not to follow God, not to listen to his prophecies. Okay, there's one comment left for me to make, and it shows the importance of reading and studying and understanding every word. You probably didn't even notice there's a sentence I didn't read, and it's at the very end. This is the lament and is to be used as a lament. What I wrote in my note, make no mistake, this is a lament. This is a funeral dirge, and it will come to pass. That sentence means this is a funeral dirge for Judah. You will be dead as a nation when Babylon conquers you. And you're going to be that way for a very long time, till 1948 for sure. So that's all I have for today, but I want to thank you for studying with me.